not only with the dogs, but with all the significant others in this community. In eloquent and somewhat complex terms, Haraway describes an imperative to share the suffering of others. She says, we're in the midst of webbed existences, multiple beings in relationship. This animal, this sick child, this village, these herds, these labs, these neighborhoods in a city, these industries and economies, these ecologies linking natures and cultures without end. This is a ramifying tapestry of shared being becoming among critters, including humans, in which living well, flourishing, and being polite, political, ethical, and right relation, means staying inside shared semiotic materiality, including the suffering inherent in unequal and ontologically multiple instrumental relationships. By the end of the film, Giovanni acknowledges that keeping the right distance risks isolating him so far from his subjects that he can't see the truth. The final scenes of the film find him boarding a bus to leave Conca d'Albero on his way to a job at an important newspaper in Milan. Giovanni muses that he's learned that keeping the right distance wouldn't have allowed him to find Mara's real killer, nor would have it allowed for his apparently happy professional outcome. Yet as he says so, he's physically distancing himself from his hometown, abandoning small-town Italy, as many young Italians have done in recent years. Furthermore, he's leaving the mystery of the dog's killer unsolved. The deaths of the dogs leave an unhealed wound in the town, a rift that signifies the deeply unhealthy, exclusive semiotic materiality of the small village. Narratively speaking, every alternative storyline is eliminated from the situated history of the town. It returns to pretending to be what it always thought it was. Giovanni, in some sense, exposed its weakness. He's banished. Mara proposes an alternative path. She's eliminated. Hassan embraced the community on its own terms, and it fails him. No one is left to tell the story of failed cohabitation, and as the camera too depicts with Giovanni, the filmic chapter closes, leaving only the silence of the horse that doesn't neigh and the dogs that can no longer bark. The Wind Blows Round begins with a short prologue and then flashes back to the beginning of the story of the Hero family in Chersonio 9 months before, a time frame that approximately corresponds, of course, to the gestation period for the human animal. When pressed by the mayor who helps facilitate the move to say when he wants to move his family of 5 to the small village, Philippe responds that he needs to do so as soon as possible, quote, before the kids are born, referring to the time when his baby goats will enter the world. So the film's framework establishes its temporal space as animal time within the life cycles of human and non-human animals. And it turns out that in this film, too, another important boundary is the one separating humans from animals, because once again, this border is intimately bound to questions of cohabitation, of how people and animals and landscapes co-evolve and coexist. The website for the Valle Maira claims that the region is selvaggia incontaminata, dove la natura è indiscussa regina. So it's wild and uncontaminated, where nature is the undisputed queen. Yet while the entrancing mountains often exceed the frame of the film in their enormity, Il Vento consistently captures pieces of landscape that betray human presence. Here a road, elsewhere a steeple, a stone wall. In the rural village in the mountains, human spaces and animal spaces overlap architectonically and otherwise, with homes and stalls blending seamlessly into one another. Chersonio has always been a space where what Haraway calls nature culture prevails, where hybrid combinations of humans, animals, and land belie the stubborn dichotomies of contemporary thought. While audiences are likely to note the linguistic polyphony that dominates the soundtrack, featuring Occitan, French, and Italian, often spoken interchangeably, the other kinds of languages also proliferate, squawking, bleating, barking, snorting, mooing, and crowing, courtesy of the many animals that exist around the borders. So we see that life there has always been a matter of partnership of the species, through which the partners come to be who they are in flesh and sign. Haraway admires a Scottish sculptor, photographer, and environmentalist, Andrew Goldsworthy, this is one of his works, whose work features ice crystals, twigs, layered rock cones, and stone walls. She notes that Goldsworthy understands that, quote, the history of the land is living, and that history is composed out of the polyform relatings of people, animals, soil, water, and rocks, and argues that his attention to human inhabitations of the land makes his art neither humanist nor naturalist, but rather an art of nature cultures. Implicit in this art is the question of how, quote, to live ethically in these mortal, finite flows that are about heterogeneous relationship, and not about man. Like Goldsworthy's installations, Diriti's film watches and listens to the living history of the land, understood as a conversation between people, animals, and the Alps' material presence, and it too asks how to live this relationship ethically. Yet the nature culture it depicts is in distress. In the sublime, pastoral space of the mountains, we might expect humans and animals to live together in some degree of harmony. But this is not the case, and in the Heraud family's struggle to coexist in their new context, we see the crisis precipitated when people enforce boundaries that perhaps should not exist. When Philippe first arrives in the village, he is greeted by a dog who barks and wags his tail. Emerging from his car, Philippe glances around the yard of a rural home, his eyes scanning its balconies, but no one is home. No humans are home, that is. In a series of shots, he exchanges gazes with the black dog who wags his tail in greeting. The dog's is actually the first gaze we see, before the camera cuts to Philippe's frank eyes, and eventually back to the amiable barking canine. This gaze becomes more significant when the French protagonist at last meets a few of the town's human inhabitants a few shots later in the local bar. Their furtive, suspicious gazes as they look on the foreigner lend immediate evidence of the hesitant human welcome for newcomers. They ascribe difference by gazing on Philippe in a way that excludes him from their tight circles. By contrast, then, and in retrospect, the dog represents a fleeting alternative that will be present throughout the film, an ethical possibility of cohabitation, inscribed in the fabric of the Alps. In an essay titled Why Look at Animals, John Berger theorizes that the animal gaze is an important moment of significant otherness, where a particularly inclusive process of recognition becomes possible. He says, quote, "When we look at animals, they return our gaze, and in that moment we are aware of both likeness and difference," end quote. For Berger, many contemporary representations of animals, including Disney films, but more incisively wildlife documentaries, are guilty of forgetting the important exchange of gazes that's possible when non-human animals are the subject. In these kinds of films, instead, he argues, quote, "Animals are always the observed. The fact that they can observe us has lost all significance. They are the objects of our ever-extending knowledge. What we know about them is an index of our power, and thus an index of what separates us from them. The more we know, the further away they are," end quote. A one-way gaze on the animal world represents looking as power and works by way of erecting boundaries. But when Philippe and the tail-wagging dog exchange, thanks to film editing, a steady level gaze, the potential of the two-way inclusive gaze that also allows animals to observe humans is momentarily restored. This idyll is brief, and the lesson that it suggests is evident throughout the film. After a period of initial reluctance, with the encouragement of the mayor, the people of Chersonia decide to work together to welcome the Heraud family to the village. Their preparations include painting a rustic kitchen and burning lavender in the stalls where the animals will be housed, so hospitality extends to their non-human guests. But when the family arrives in town, the goats are immediately led to their new quarters, and then human interactions. Words of welcome, a communal meal begin. So initially, it seems that the residents of Chersonia will recall, as their mayor urges them to, that these new inhabitants reanimate an integral part of the town's agricultural past. As Haraway notes, the guardian dogs, sheep, goats, and herders that migrated in Africa, Europe, and Asia have literally carved deep tracks into soil and rock, tracks which have been compared to the carving of glaciers. Companion relationships extend to the land, which shape the animals who shape the landscapes. But the period of amity is short-lived. After a few sequences of rambles on spectacular mountainsides, sun-filled church picnics, and rousing community festivals, the town begins to regard the French family's otherness not as significant, but as threatening. Allegations are leveled in particular against the goats, when residents begin to police the borders of their often unfenced land in the mountains. And will be the next clip I'm going to show you.
Salve. Le piace il rischio? L'ho vista spesso qui sul precipizio del Salto dei Cani. Sono venuto a cercarla per parlarle. Ho visto l'altro giorno le sue capre.